At the top of the screen, we have the Logitech Brio, and it is set to 4K 30 frames per second at MJPEG. This gets to a 90-degree field of view. At the bottom of the screen, we have the Logitech C922. This is set to 1080p 30 frames per second, maximum resolution on both of these, and this has a field of view of 78 degrees. I bought my Logitech Brio for $157, and I bought my Logitech C922 for $135. But prices on both of these fluctuate drastically, so to see current pricing on both of these devices, I have links to them in the description. This is Logitech Brio by itself, 4K 30 frames per second. This is what it looks like just individually, and just look at the motion blur here. And now let's go ahead and take a look at the autofocus. Super slow right now, super slow. But it's good to give you an example of how slow it might be. All right, that's Logitech Brio. Let's go ahead and take a look at the Logitech C922 individually now. C922 individually now, and a lot darker of an image. This is how it looks. A lot more narrow field of view also, 78 degrees. Autofocus demonstration. Logitech C922. Then this is both of these devices together now, fully automatic settings. So now I've set the Logitech Brio to 1080p 60 frames per second so that you can see a little bit more of the fluidity of this. Let's go ahead and look at it individually. Logitech Brio 1080p, and it is at 60 frames per second. This is what this device looks like. You lose a lot of the sharpness obviously, but the idea is that you should have a more smooth image, and it's really going to depend largely on the shutter speed, but I'll get into that a little bit later. So something that the Logitech C922 specifically can do that the C920 can't is 720p at 60 frames per second. So now I've set the C922 to 60 frames per second so that we can kind of mimic the frames per second, like the smoothness of the Brio that we're getting. But let's see how much of a damage that does to the actual resolution of the image if we go ahead and blow this thing up. So let's take a look. So this is a C922 at 720p 60 frames per second. Now, personally, I think that this looks terrible, especially in the year that I'm recording this, but this is what it looks like. If we go ahead and try to take a look at text, you'll be able to notice a giant difference with text as far as the sharpness. Let's see if we can even get it to focus and see. Okay, so even when it's fully focused, it's actually kind of hard to read the actual text. And when you have smaller text like this, it's just like brutal. Yeah, it's in focus, but it's just not very sharp at all. Can't really read a whole lot. And the Logitech Brio, on the other hand, and this is only 1080p on the Brio right now, obviously be way better if I showed it off in 4K. So that's the 720p 60 frames per second on the Logitech C922. Okay, now I've turned on my studio lighting and I'm using manual settings. So in front of me, I have an Elgato ring light, an Elgato key light, and a newer 18-inch advanced ring light. That light behind me is off because I have enough light coming in through the window, and I've reviewed those lights on my channel if you want to take a look. And right now, the Logitech Brio is at 1080p 60 frames per second MJPEG, and the C922 is at 720p 60 frames per second MJPEG. Let's look at them individually. And here's the Logitech Brio, 1080p, 60 frames per second. And I have the auto white balance off. I also have the autofocus off, of course. So it's not going to change the lighting. It's not going to try to focus in on anything because I don't mess with either of those. I do fully manual if ever possible. And this is what it looks like, 1080p, 60 frames per second. Let's go ahead and move on to the C922. C922 at 720p, 60 frames per second. And this is the device, this is the smoothness, this is how it is, Logitech C922. Now I'm going to do a full analysis of all these clips at the end, but if you're thinking that, hey man, the top looks really yellow and the bottom is like, just more balanced white, the wall actually is that yellow. It is daylight, it's about like 2:21 or so, And even with my studio lights, they can't quite counterbalance how much yellow light is coming in. So actually, they're not as washed out as the C922. They look a lot closer to the Brio. Same with my skin tone, same with pretty much all the white in the image. It actually does look way more like the Brio. Anyway, now we've got the C922 at 1080p 30 frames per second. So let's go ahead and compare them individually so that we can see, which 1080p is better. Manual settings, 1080p 30 frames per second on the Logitech C922. And of course, we got the studio lighting going as well. And then this is the Logitech Brio with 1080p and 60 frames per second and its fully manual settings. So let's go ahead and check individually, or actually by both of them. So this is what both of them look like together. That's what we got. And now, of course, we have the 4K enabled on the Logitech Brio. Let's go ahead and look at it individually. Logitech Brio, 4K, 30 frames per second, studio lighting, manual settings, incredibly sharp. This is how I film like 90% of my videos, 95%. I try to do all of them with this unless I'm like testing webcams specifically. This is how I do it. And just to keep in mind, a lot of times you won't even find the Logitech Brio even called Brio. If you look in the store, you might just see it called Logitech 4K Pro Webcam or something, Logitech 4K Stream, all kinds of random names that Logitech throws out, but it's still the Logitech Brio. This is their only 4K webcam as of now, so that's what it is. So as far as my analysis on these images, starting with sharpness, it's no contest. The Brio is just way sharper. 1080p is sharper than the C922's 1080p, and of course the 720, there's no point in really using that on the C922 in my opinion. The 4K just blows every webcam on the market just out of the water. As we go to color accuracy, the background looks a little bit yellow if you have never seen this background, but if you actually are in this room and you see the yellow light coming in, it's actually pretty accurate. It is a little bit too yellow, I would say. I tried to drag the white balance back to make it more blue, but I didn't want to make it look too blue because that's not really accurate to what we're seeing. So the white balance is not as good as like the Stream Cam. It's not as good as the Razer Kiyo Pro, but definitely better than the super duper washed out Logitech C922, which is how it looks. Also, there's like extra red in that image where there should be like some kind of brown and some orange. Like in my face, it looks like totally washed out. I can't actually increase the saturation of that thing. So right here, I've given a boost to the saturation of the C922, but I'm not sure if that type of red is getting closer to what I really want or if I just keep it default. So you can do what you want, but let me bring it back down a little bit. This is the default at 128. You can increase it, but I just think the Logitech Brio is just kind of beats it in colors. You look, I have all these like boxes from all these headsets I've been testing, and they're a lot more washed out on the C922. So yeah, color accuracy goes to the Brio. Now, as far as the exposure and dynamic range, like the lighting, I think that the Logitech Brio, it's able to really show detail. I think the dynamic range is really where it shows. Like my shirt, you can see how faded it is, but it still has a lot of the detail of the color of the black. You just really, and like my hat, it's not really way too washed out. The fact that it can get this white, this bright, and this detailed, and the darks this detailed, the dynamic range is just really good on the Logitech Brio, one of the best on the market. But the C922 doesn't really do too bad. There's a lot of webcams that like when you have some sort of light like in the background, like hitting the back wall, you can't see those slits of light coming in through the blinds. It's actually not even easy to see that in real life. So that's actually a pretty good job. A lot of webcams totally struggle with that. So C922, not really a slouch, but I think the Brio just does a better job exposure dynamic range. The image is very bright, very vibrant. I like that a lot, but not like overexposed. Even with that window, you see the windows in the shot of the Brio. A lot of webcams will like completely struggle when they see any sort of like light source. Autofocus is, I guess, a tie. I turn autofocus off. I would highly suggest just bringing these things. The focus range is not very long. It's maybe like, I don't know, like a foot or 2 feet. Once you get past that, everything's basically in focus. So I think you might as well just slide the autofocus all the way off and then just like, or slide the focus slider all the way back and then turn autofocus off because really there's not much point in using it. Now, this is the microphone from the Logitech C922. I am not the type of person that recommends using microphones on webcams, but a lot of people do. So this is the microphone from the Logitech C922. And let's go ahead and switch on over to the Logitech Brio. There are no filters or anything on it. This is just straight, the microphone. Now here is the built-in microphone from the Logitech Brio. This is what this device sounds like. Logitech Brio built-in microphone test. That's what it sounds like. So as far as my verdict, this is an absolute no contest. I give the win to the Logitech Brio. This really isn't much of a competition, and you might even be wondering why I even compared these. Mainly, it's just because I know so many people are looking this up on Google and they're looking it up on YouTube search, so they'll stumble into it. So if that's you, then yeah, that's why I made this. I do not recommend this device. I know a lot of people have been buying this device, and I never recommend it. The reason is because even though it's not inherently bad, I don't think that the price increase over the Logitech C920 is worth it. Just get the Logitech C920, save however many bucks, because a lot of times you can find the Logitech C920, depending on where you look, for like $50 or $60 or whatever. And it's like, I bought this for $135. It's like, dude, like, all it does is the 720/60. That's the only difference between this and the C920. Just get the C920 and then get like a dedicated microphone. You don't have to buy this. This costs $200. This mic is $200. But yeah, just get the C920 or get this. There's no reason to get the Stopgate C922, in my opinion. But maybe, do whatever you want to do, I guess. Links to both of these devices are in the description.